Today on The Intentional Life, I'm going to share with you something worse than making the wrong decision. Look at the story of the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11 a little bit. Many people kind of read that story and wonder, is God really afraid of people building an ancient tower? So I'm going to give you some insights that you might miss or misunderstand when reading that story. I'm going to look at this article on how digital technology has made us worse at memorizing things and in what ways that matters and what ways it doesn't. So how our memory has been affected by recent technology the last couple of decades. And then I'll end with a book review called from the book Because Internet, which is about how the internet is changing how we speak and communicate and some insights I took away from the book. We will begin, like always, in our intentionality corner. In this case, I want to share with you why, in many cases, indecision is actually worse than the wrong decision. So indecision can actually be a worse thing than making a wrong decision. Let me kind of explain some thoughts and give you some insights into what I'm thinking here. Here's the reality. In many cases, indecision is worse than making the wrong decision. Why? Well, for example, a wrong decision gives you the opportunity to learn and grow for the future. Indecisions teach you nothing. So you can't learn from an indecision. A wrong decision teaches you what doesn't work, which can help you actually move closer to what does work, which of course indecision cannot help you do. A wrong decision can also create courage. If you can rebound from this decision, then you begin to learn that the worst case scenarios typically aren't as bad as you think, because you might actually have to experience some bad scenarios that you got out of, therefore giving you courage, which again, indecision cannot do. On the other hand, again, indecision teaches you nothing. Indecision doesn't help you narrow down your options from the things of like, what actually should I be pursuing? Indecision leaves you paralyzed, unable to build your courage muscle because you aren't actually trying anything and realizing it's going to be okay if things don't always go perfectly according to plan. So if you're not sure what to do, just know that indecision is a decision, and it is a decision to remain stuck. It could be the case, by the way, that the worst decision you could make in terms of long-term consequences is not to make a decision at all. That actually could be the worst thing you can make for your long-term consequences. Now, of course, caveats, if it's a life-altering decision you got to make and you make a wrong one, sure. But I'm just talking about generally speaking, decisions in your job, maybe pursuing a hobby or a career, a dream, trying to do something new, and you're not sure what to do. An indecision is a decision. So just remember, the problem is we often think that indecision is neutral. It's like, well, I could do this thing or not. And if I don't do anything, if I don't make a decision, well, that's just neutral. You just need to remember that indecision is not neutral. It is a decision. It's a decision not to learn, grow, or try. Like, for example, give me an example that probably many of us can relate to. You think about like going to watch a show on Netflix or a streaming service, and you're not really sure what you want to watch, or maybe you finished a show and you're looking for another one, and because there are so many options, you don't know what to do. So you scroll through all these episodes and all these series titles. You maybe watch a trailer here or there. And here's the thing. It's not fun. Like the indecision is not actually fun. And then what happens is like you take so long that it could be like 30 minutes later, an hour later, and you haven't done anything. You're no closer to finding a show you actually want to watch. Indecision is not actually helpful. It's actually more helpful to be, I'm not sure about the show. Let me watch the first 15 minutes and see if I'm interested at all. Of course, this is a low-hanging fruit. Like there's nothing bad going to happen if you don't make a decision here. But that's an example I think we all can relate to. So again, remember, if you need to make a decision, decide on that. So I'm not saying that like you got to make quick decisions all the time and figure it out right now, and whatever you're not sure what to do, you got to figure it out today. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is sometimes you do need to take some time before you make a decision. So I would say decide that. Say, hey, I'm going to take the next week, the next month. I'm going to have a conversation with 3 more people, whatever it is, but decide when you're actually going to make your decision. Don't just say, I need more time with an indefinite plan of how you're going to come to a decision and when you're going to make it. And so the decision you might have to make is, I'm not making a decision today, but here's what I'm going to do, or here is my timeline to make a decision, and pick a deadline. That can be your decision. Now, a big limiting factor for many people is thinking that you don't know enough. So you're going to pursue, that workout plan. I know it's a cliche example, or trying to build a skill or something like that, learn an instrument. But you don't know what you should start at. You don't know what practice regimen you should do or strategy you should take, right? So you don't know anything. And so again, this is a big limiting factor. This is what leads to a lot of indecisions. But just know you can never know as much as you want to know without doing. You can never know as much as you want to know without doing. So yes, of course, when you are just starting out, you might be a little overwhelmed by the options or the information, or you might not know where to start. But just by starting, you begin to decide, hey, is this working? Is this not working? And to build skills and information that way. So you will never know as much as you could know if you'll just actually start. Now, this could be helpful as well when you're kind of thinking about this. It's not whether I will try or start that thing, but I will do the thing. I will do either option or A or option B. This is a better way to think about it. So, hey, I know I need to figure out how to, I don't know, get better at clean. I need to organize my house. I don't know. That's the example I think of. So it's not about like, should I organize the room or should I not? It should be, hey, should I organize it this way or organize it that way? But it has to be one of those ways. So for example, like if you want to get better photography, it's not like, man, I'm not sure the first step I should take. What you should decide is, hey, for example, I need to take an online photography course. There's course A that interests me. There's course B that interests me. So the question is not, am I going to take a course? The question is, which one am I actually going to take? So that might be something to consider, to think about. If you're trying to be more intentional with your life and your decisions and you feel stuck on something, it's not, hey, am I going to do something? You can decide, I'm going to do either A or B, but I have to pick one of those. That can help with indecision. It's not between doing something or doing nothing. It's I'm going to find a couple of options, and then my decision is going to be one of those options. It's not going to be indecision. I'm not sure what to do. It cannot be nothing. Again, just remember and don't forget that indecision is a decision. Indecision is a decision. And can I just say, indecision is usually the decision you are going to regret next year. Indecision is usually the decision you're going to regret next year. Now, it might take some courage to try the thing. I get that. But a year from now, you're going to wish you had actually tried and done the thing. Again, indecision is a decision, and it's the one you're probably going to regret over not trying anything or potentially making the wrong decision in the first place. Again, in many cases, indecision is worse than making the wrong decision. Moving on to our faith reflection for today's episode. I kind of put it this way. Was God scared of a tower? So in Genesis chapter 11, I'm going to read some of the verses here. I actually could do a much more deeper dive on this, but I'm going to try to keep it somewhat succinct. Of course, as a pastor, keeping it succinct, those things maybe not always be going together. But in Genesis chapter 11, there's a story of the Tower of Babel, where people are trying to build a tower to the heavens to communicate with the gods, or God, the gods, their concept of the deities. And I'm going to explain to you what's going on here and why we can misunderstand it. So in Genesis chapter 11, verse 1, I'm going to read a couple of verses and just explain it. It says this in verse 1 of Genesis 11. It says, the whole earth had the same language and vocabulary. As people migrated from the east, they found a valley in the land of Shinar and settled there. Now, as a side note, in the Old Testament, in Genesis, anytime people are going to the east, it's always a bad thing. Adam and Eve were kicked to the east of the garden. Cain and Abel, after Cain kills his brother Abel, he's sent further east. And so one of the things you'll pick up on, if you're an astute reader in Genesis and the Old Testament, is if somebody's moving to the east, especially in Genesis, things aren't going to go well. So you got people migrated from the east. Verse 3 says this. They said to each other, come, let's make oven-fired bricks. They used brick for stone and asphalt for mortar. Verse 4, and they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the sky. Let's make a name for ourselves, otherwise we will be scattered throughout the earth. Now, remember, in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, what are Adam and Eve told to do? Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. Now, again, we have a problem here because in verse 4, people don't want to be scattered. They want to be all together so they can do the things that they want to do. So I already know we get a second red flag. Number one, they're going east, not good. Number two, these people are doing the exact opposite of what God told Adam and Eve was the role for humanity. I also want to say this. It's important to remember that in specifically the first 5 books of the Old Testament, but I think this argument can be made for many of the books in the Old Testament. Again, context is important here, but especially in Genesis in this section, earth is actually in the Hebrew actually means land. Now we've translated earth. There's good reasons for that. But some scholars would submit to you, and I think I'm kind of persuaded on this, that particularly in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, when the writers are talking about the earth or the land, they're actually talking about the promised land. They're actually talking about the promised land. So again, when we think earth, we think globe. These people were not necessarily thinking globe. They didn't necessarily have that knowledge. And there's a good argument to be made that anytime it says earth or land, especially in the first 5 books of the Bible, or most of the time, it's actually not even talking about like all the earth. It's talking about the promised land that God has for his people. So they're the whole earth. So you could be saying the whole land, like, or in other words, that whole geographical area. Everybody spoke the same language, or that everybody in the land area, or again, I think it's the promised land area, spoke the same language. So in other words, it could be saying everyone in all human existence at this time spoke the same language, or everybody in this region spoke the same language. Regardless, what you see happening here is a whole bunch of people can communicate and they can work together. And they want to build a tower to the gods or to God. And again, they're going east, so that's bad. So further from God, they don't want to scatter. They're all doing the same thing. Verse 5. Then the Lord came down to look over the city and the tower that the humans were building. The Lord said, if they have begun to do this as one people, all having the same language, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let's go down there and confuse their language so that they will understand one another's speech. Now, I just want to say this. Twice in verse 7, it says the Lord came down. Verse 5, the Lord came down. Verse 7, come, let's go down. Again, it's probably the idea of God talking to some of the heavenly council. And it's this idea of like, they wanted to build a tower to the heavens, like this big impressive thing. In reality, God has to come down to see it. In other words, it's not impressive. God's not impressed. Verse 8, so from there, the Lord scattered them throughout the earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore, it is called Babylon, for the Lord confused the language of the whole earth. And from there, the Lord scattered them throughout the earth, or throughout the land. Now, big picture, let me just hit on some things of what's going on here. One, the question is God really afraid of humans? Because it looks like he's like afraid that like all these humans are going to get together and they're going to do whatever they want, and I'm not going to be able to stop them. So is God really afraid of humans? And the second question is, why does he intervene in this way? Why does he intervene in such a way to make it impossible for them to continue what they're doing? So if they can't communicate, obviously they can't be on the same page of what they're doing. They're going to go their separate ways. So why is God afraid of people doing this and getting power? And why does he do this sort of kind of curse, if you will, of what they're doing? Now, a couple of things I want to talk through. Here's a question you might ask, like, what is God afraid of? Is it the fact that it's a city? Is it cities that God has a problem with? So I remember when I was a kid being confused about the story, because then they said they're going to build a great city. However, the cities that we have today are way bigger than any of those towns. Probably most of you that are listening to this, wherever you're listening to this, the city you are in is probably more populated than whatever area they were. Like even a rural towns, a lot of rural towns in America still had more people than perhaps what was going on in this area. So the question is, I got confused. It's like cities are way more bigger now than they are then. So like, why doesn't God stop cities now if he stopped like a smaller city then? So is that the problem? I don't think it's the fact that it's a city. Is the problem how big or tall the structure they are building? So you might be saying, well, maybe the problem is like they're going to build a really big, tall skyscraper to the heavens type of a thing. Again, I always thought that also can't be the problem because today, as you know, buildings are way bigger, way taller than anything in the ancient world, and God hadn't like struck those things down or stopped those things to be built. So it can't probably be like the fact that they're trying to build a tall building necessarily. So what's going on? I just want to mention this. In the ancient Near Eastern times, especially around the time period where this tower would have been built, we actually do know, we don't know exactly, but when urbanization started happening historically, in other words, when people started to try to be more or less hunter-gatherer, for lack of a better word, less mobile, but like actually like started to build crops and kind of like stay in a central geographical area. A city was actually not designed to house people. So people did not live in the city. So in most ancient cities, and certainly this is true for the Old Testament, when the scriptures talk about a city, they're talking about a walled area. A walled area. So a city is like a town that has walls. Now, most people actually live outside the city walls, and inside the city walls was comprised of public buildings with various uses. So there would be typically some sort of temple or religious activity, some sort of like temple complex, maybe some like legal area. There could be some sort of market inside the city walls. And so most people actually would live outside the city, and everybody would go to the city to do kind of their interacting day-to-day things. Now, the tower they would have built inside this little city with walls would have undoubtedly be what's called a ziggurat. So if you just Google like a picture of a ziggurat, you can see something to the effect of what this tower was going to look like. In ancient Mesopotamian literature, almost every time you see a tower with its top in the sky or a tower with its head in the heavens, which is how sometimes it's described in some of this ancient literature, and of course how it's described here in Genesis, it's almost always referring to a ziggurat, which is how we know this is probably a ziggurat structure. It's an idiomatic saying. It's kind of like when it says with its tower in the sky or with its head in the heavens. It's like today we call something a skyscraper. Like it's not actually scraping the sky. It just means it's like really high up. It means it's a high picture, or it's really high in the sky. So especially in the ancient world, they're building an ancient version of a skyscraper. Now, understanding the function of a ziggurat helps us understand exactly the problem here. Like what's actually the problem here. And I am persuaded, at least personally, that the biggest problem with what is happening with this city and with this tower is not pride, although pride, making a name for ourselves, that's a bad thing. I don't think that's the primary issue. I certainly don't think the issue is urbanization of like a bunch of people living in the same area necessarily. I don't think that's the primary issue. After all, for example, Israel has a capital city as well. They eventually make Jerusalem their capital city. They build a really big temple and they build walls around Jerusalem. And God's blessing was to be fruitful and multiply. It wasn't be fruitful and spread out. So that might be implied, that if you're going to multiply, you're going to spread out. But it's be fruitful and multiply. So as long as you're being fruitful and multiply and, kind of going where you want to go. But it's the bigger issue here is it's not necessarily that they're not scattering, although I do think that is part of the problem because it's the exact same language that Adam and Eve are given that these people are not doing. But that's not, again, I don't think that's the primary issue. So I don't think that's the primary issue. The blessing, again, was procreation, not whether or not someone spreads out doesn't change the number of people. So again, they need to be fruitful and multiply. That was Adam and Eve. The blessing was to multiply in number, so that's kind of what they're told. And again, I am persuaded that the issue here is what they are doing or what they think they are doing with the ziggurat. So it's not necessarily how many people are living in the city, and it's not even how tall this tower is going to be. It is the reason for doing what they're doing. So let me keep explaining. I know this might be a little deep or kind of tricky, but if you track with me, let me explain a little bit further. A ziggurat was viewed as a stairway to heaven. So this is how it was viewed in the ancient world. It was the means by which the gods or divine beings or messengers, angels, that sort of thing, whatever this local group thought of the deities, that sort of thing. It was where the place where gods moved between heaven, earth, and the underworld. So kind of in modern day language, think of it like a portal. It's kind of like a portal in modern thinking. So this ziggurat, which was a massive stairway to the top of the tower, was a visual representation of what was believed to be used by the gods to travel from one realm to another. So they're trying to make this massive portal for the gods to come down to them. It was solely used for the convenience of the gods, and the ziggurats were maintained in order to provide the deities with the amenities that would refresh them along the way. So it was for the deities to come and go, give their blessing, that sort of thing, or at least that was the assumption. And so at the top of the ziggurat was what was often called the gate of the gods. That's kind of like where their quote-unquote portal would be. This is where the divine beings, their presence would come. There was a room at the very top, usually, which would include a bed and a table. And at the bottom of the temple, right nearby the bottom staircase of the ziggurat, where they would hope the deities would descend to receive the gifts and worships of the people. So they'd kind of pop through the portal, their presence would pop through the portal, they'd come down the staircase, and then they would like bless the people. That's kind of like how it would work. And so they would have like sacrifices and stuff right outside, right near the bottom of the ziggurat. The hope, again, the ziggurat itself was not for public use, so it's not like a lot of people were going up and down the ziggurat itself. It was the temple area where the gods would supposedly descend to, and then outside, all around the ziggurat, is where sacrifices or various things would be happening. So I would think of it like this, to maybe make this a little more easy to track with. When the American West was being settled, people would often pick up and move and create towns into proximity of newly laid railroad tracks. So when the railroad was being built, towns were often built at like stops along the railroad tracks. Then they would erect a train station so that the train would stop and bring economic benefits to that town. And that's kind of what's happening here. The people are settling around this big city, trying to get the favor of the gods and they're working together to say, hey, maybe if enough people come, build this tower, we'll experience the blessing and the presence of the gods. So what's going on here is the Tower of Babel project is a temple complex which features a massive ziggurat which was designed to make it convenient for the gods to come down to a temple, which would have been right next to the ziggurat, to receive worship from the people, and hopefully, if the people are good enough, to bless them. That's what's being built here. Now, the question then is, what is the issue? What is the issue with this? Well, obviously, worshiping false gods is an issue. The question is, why so drastic an intervention, however, because people have been worshiping false gods for forever. This is not even the first time in Genesis that people are doing bad things, or worshiping false gods. So again, what is the issue right here? That's the question. Again, I don't think it's pride or urbanization. I think it's something else. In ancient Mesopotamia, I would say this. Urbanization began to bring significant changes to religious thought, and you actually see this historically with the early Babylonian and Assyrian nations, that it started to become popular to create and set up statues in temples, again, because people are less, I mean, there certainly are a lot of nomadic people, but in the urban centers, people are no longer nomads. And so there is this, you would see this creation of regional and local gods. So in the ancient world, you have like regional and local gods because people lived there, statues were created, that sort of thing. And the intent was to support and sacrifice these local gods so they will bless you, and so you would build these structures. So people were no longer trying to be like God. So after Adam and Eve are exiled, the first couple of chapters in Genesis, you see people trying to be like God, which is not a good thing. They were now trying to bring God down to the level of humanity. They began to be viewed, the people began to be viewed as acting like humans. I'm sorry. The gods began to be viewed as acting like humans. So up to Genesis 11, problem, people are trying to act like God. Now they're viewing God as acting like a human. For example, one biblical scholar, J.J. Finkelstein, says this: the Babylonian gods, although not themselves bound by moral or ethical principles, nevertheless appreciated them and expected humans to live by them. The Babylonians, it would seem, fashioned their gods in their own image more faithfully than the Israelites did theirs. So the Babylonians were like, hey, this is how we act. We want people to be kind to us and do favors for us. And in response, like, we'll treat them and we'll give them favors. So that's how they assumed the gods worked as well. And so the needs of the gods who would make use of the ziggurat stairway and be served in such a ways reflects the weaknesses and the distortion of deities brought about by the Babylonian gods and how they viewed them. In other words, they are starting to attribute human-like qualities to non-human beings, that is God. They are making God in their image. Here's the problem what's happening here. Is at the Tower of Babel, you're now making God, or in their case, they think the gods, act like human beings. You have to do all these things and bribe the gods and to get gods to do what you want, because that's how we treat each other. And so instead of being made in God's image and reflecting who he is, we're making the gods, or God, act like a human being. Another biblical scholar, John Walton, says it this way: the offense in this passage, then, is to be found in the beliefs that resulted in the project and what it stood for in the mind of the builders. It went beyond mere idolatry. It degraded the nature of God by portraying him as having needs. So this is the first story in the scriptures where it's like, hey, the gods, the deities, they have needs. We got to help them. Which, by the way, this is a very ancient, when you look at the different creation myths of the ancient Mesopotamian area, one of the uniquenesses to the Genesis story is that God creates humans not because he needs something from them, but simply because he loves them. All the other ancient creation myths are the gods essentially got tired and they want the humans to do the dirty work for them. That's what's happening here. So we're going to do this stuff for the gods and then they're going to bless us, as if God actually needs that. That's not what God actually needs. And so again, they create the ziggurat for the gods, and then God himself comes down mockingly, again in verse 5 and 8, but to judge what they're doing, not to accept what they're doing. So God does come down and judges it. And so again, in verse 6, when it says, God says nothing they plan to do will be impossible from them or withheld from them in some translations, what he's saying is that their uniting together has led to terrible results. Right? God is not scared of humans. I want to be clear. That's not the problem. He's not scared of humans. The problem is that these human beings are changing this view of who God actually is. And so they're uniting together has led, he judges that in a manner to prevent these people from continuing down this path. So this judgment here is, if they're going to try to get like all the people of the earth to do this thing, to spread this idea that I'm like a human, or I'm made in human image, that is not good. And so we get this very severe judgment. I'll give you one more quotation from Bible scholar John Walton. Again, he explains it this way. Of course, pagan So let me actually say this before I read this quote. I will say this. So in this story, again, here's the problem. It's no longer humanity that is being corrupted, which of course they have been corrupted up until this point in Genesis. It is their view of who God is that is now being distorted and twisted beyond recognition. Humans are shown to be morally destitute up to Genesis 11, and now they're being shown to be theologically destitute as well, because the people at Babel have lost any sense of who God really is. That this is not at all how God operates, and so we see a massive judgment in the story to show us, do not treat God like this. This is not how he operates. Again, last quote by John Walton, he says this. Of course, pagan polytheism in the ancient world is not unique to Babylon, happening all over the place. It is the heritage of all Israel's neighbors. And this is exactly the point. This diluted view of God becomes ubiquitous. At the core of this view is the belief that the gods have needs. Worship and human response to the gods in general are directed towards meeting those needs. The gods need to be fed, clothed, and housed. They are pampered, patronized, and manipulated. The heart of paganism is not found in the perversity of rituals, but in the degradation of the deity. When gods are distinguished only by their power instead of by their character, transcendence, and autonomy, they become puppets filled with nitroglycerin. Make them do whatever you want, however you can, but be careful not to jar them too much or they may explode. Now, maybe some big words in there, kind of a long quote, but again, the problem is they're making humans in their image, thinking God actually needs them. I would put it this way, listen, the worst thing you can do, at least according to Genesis 11, the worst thing you can do is to make God in your image. The worst thing you can do is to make God in your image. Again, according to the Genesis ideal, we are God's image bearers. In Genesis 11, they are making God in their image. And by the way, the human creation ideal is not at all the goodness of gracious of God, right? The human thing is like the strong eat the weak, gain power, gain authority, do whatever you want, take control, be in charge. But Jesus, of course, comes and has this upside down kingdom, that the greatest in the kingdom serves, loves, gives grace, forgiveness, right? It is totally different. That we make really bad gods. I like to think of it this way, trying to make something in your image. For those of you that are video gamers or grew up playing video games like I did, I remember as a kid playing like basketball or football, whatever sports game it was, and you could do your customized player. You could do a customized player, and you could like do the stats, and you could do all these sort of thing, and how fast they are, how strong they are, and that sort of thing. And I just want to say this: what's happening here is these people are making their own player, but what they're not doing is they're not making the attributes all 99. So again, in these video games, 99 overall is the best you could do. And so what you would typically do is you would go in there, especially in the early days, and you would you'd move all your attributes all the way up to just 99, 99, 99. So you literally could be the best player in the game. What's happening here is they're making a player and they are not giving him all 99s. All right, again, the human nature is selfish. It is looking out for yourself. It can be vindictive. It can be manipulative. It can be gossipy. And this is not who God is. So they're making God in their image, and it is woefully short of the God we see in the Bible. We've even already seen, if you're reading Genesis, in order, you have in 11 chapters, you see stories of God's patience, God's love, God's promise of redemption, even when Adam and Eve sinned right away, and then multiple times after that there's going to be a hope coming. You see that love is not based on our efforts. You see that value is not based on anything we produce, but simply for being his creation, that all people are made in God's image and are valuable because he created us, not in what we produce. And so I just want to say, man, who wants to serve the gods we create? Because when we create God in our image, it is a far lesser God. I would say this way, would you want God to treat you the way you want to treat people who make you angry? So the person who cuts you off on the road, the person who stabs you in the back, like you ain't about to give love and forgiveness to that person, right? It's really, really hard. Again, a God in our image, let me put it this way, a God in our image doesn't lead to the gospel. A God in our image is not a God who would lay down his life for his friends, for sinners, for broken people who do not deserve it, who can never pay it back. But this is who our God is. Now, lastly, I'm not going to read it just because I've already talked enough about this. But what's amazing here, I just want to point this out. In Acts chapter 2, in the New Testament, you have Pentecost. Jesus has already ascended back into heaven. And then the Holy Spirit comes down, and Peter preaches a sermon, and thousands of people are saved after Peter's sermon. And part of the reason is because everybody starts speaking in tongues. Now, in Acts chapter 2, they're speaking in real human languages. In ancient Jerusalem at this time, again, a lot of people are bilingual, trilingual. You spoke a lot of languages. What happens is all these people start sharing the gospel in their native tongue. And all the other people who could speak native tongue around these various people start hearing the gospel in their native tongue. And it tells us that thousands of people, 3,000 people came to faith in one day. And so what you see is Acts chapter 2 is the great reversal of Genesis 11, where tongues of many languages are sharing the good news. This idea is like no matter what language you speak in Acts 2, you hear the gospel because you're actually accurately teaching who God is. In Genesis 11, you have a faulty, degraded, wrong view of God. And so God creates multiple languages to stop that spread of that teaching. That's not who God is. In Acts 2, when they actually get it right, God unifies them and has the gospel taught in all those different languages. So again, I know there was a lot. Hopefully you were able to track somewhat, but the worst thing you can do is make God in your image. And I would just submit to you, that's the big problem here. We are supposed to see in this story, don't do that. Now, switching gears a little bit to our cultural analysis, I read a really fascinating article about memory, so I'm going to read some of the highlights and share some thoughts. This article was by Carl Hendrick. It's called "The Most Important Memory is Still the One Inside Your Head," written on June 14th, 2025 on his Substack, which is kind of like a newsletter. So if you just Google Carl Hendrick, "The Most Important Memory is Still the One Inside Your Head," you'll probably see it. Again, June 14th, 2025 is when he wrote it. I'll read you the intro to his article. He says this: "We're living through an extraordinary cognitive paradox. Just as artificial intelligence gives us unprecedented access to information, there is evidence to suggest we're becoming less intelligent. IQ scores, which rose steadily for nearly a century, have plateaued and begun declining in wealthy nations. People born after 1975 score lower on intelligence tests than their parents did at the same age," and I'm assuming that means on average. And so he starts to talk about how there is the issue, of course, of correlation and causation. So just because, again, he's going to submit in this article that tech use has gone up, that doesn't necessarily mean that's like the primary or the only reason IQ scores have gone down. I also want to say this, which he doesn't mention in this article, because I've read a little bit about IQ stuff in various books. IQ scores are a little bit based on what you're actually testing, kind of develop someone's IQ. So about 100 years ago, when IQ scores really started to take off, it's not because people all of a sudden got like super intelligent. It's because the way we used to teach kids and the way that IQ is used, the way IQ is tested, math, reasoning, that sort of thing, we started to teach it a certain way. And so it led to higher IQ results. And so it's not that like people in the 1700s or until like the beginning of the 1900s were all stupid. It's just that we began to learn differently. And so IQ tests a certain type of knowledge. It doesn't test it's a little bit of a misnomer in my opinion, because someone with a high IQ, it's a certain type of knowledge they're really smart at. It's not like, that doesn't mean that they're intelligent in like all areas of life. Anyway, regardless, this has also come at the same time, of course, as the rise of digital tools and how common they have become. So at least in how IQ is tested and how we measure it, it's kind of going down as these digital tools are going up. He goes on to say this: over the last 50 years, the idea that memorization is much less important than generalized critical thinking became a largely uncontested orthodoxy in education. Of course, rote memorization of disconnected facts without linking them to the broader concepts and ideas is a joyless, pointless enterprise, but recent research suggests we may have thrown the baby out with the bathwater, creating a false dichotomy between memory and understanding that has undermined the very cognitive functions we sought to strengthen. So again, this idea is that we've shifted in the last 50 years to kind of downgrading the importance of memorization because it's so accessible, and just think critically generally overall. Now here's the problem. The problem is not memorization in itself. Like, obviously that's helpful, but a misunderstanding of how memory works. So we misunderstand the importance of memory. So to our detriment, we kind of say, hey, memorization doesn't matter. Of course, we all know, as the article points out, it is not fun to memorize math or vocabulary or maybe Bible verses or random bits of information or maybe jargon and information related to your job or career. It's not fun necessarily to memorize these things. The problem, however, is that we view memorization as just merely storing up facts. But in fact, it is knowing all of this information and having it memorized that enables us. It enables things like mathematical intuition and sophisticated reasoning to take place. So you need to have a certain amount of knowledge memorized and in your brain so that you can decipher it and come up with more sophisticated solutions. So, for example, article talked about how different ways math began to be taught in the 90s, how certain literacy and reading that started to be taught in the 80s was kind of different than it was before. And then a certain teacher training tool, which I'm not familiar with, we also reinforced the idea that treated factual recall as a lower order skill. So I guess just how teaching has been done the last 30, 40 years has kind of memorized the importance of memorization. And some things that have taken place in the 21st century have given the idea that because we have easy access to information online and at our fingertips, memorization is no longer necessary. I think all of us have probably thought that at some point. It's like, what's the point of memorizing this? Because I can just Google it, or today I can chat GPT it, right? So no longer necessary. Now, in response to that, he says this in his article. He says, the declarative system handles conscious facts and statements, the deliberate recall of explicit information, in other words, memorization. It functions like a rapidly learning but somewhat cumbersome library, carefully cataloging new acquisitions. When you first learn that 7 times 8 equals 56, your declarative system dutifully records this information. So when you first learn your times tables, not fun, but eventually you memorize it. It goes on to say this, the procedural system, I guess the different ways the brain works, by contrast, acquires habits, skills, and routines through repeated practice. It operates like a well-trained craftsman who has an internalized technique to the point of artistry. With sufficient practice, 7 times 8 becomes not a fact to be retrieved, but a response as automatic as breathing. The crucial insight from this research is that expertise emerges precisely when knowledge transitions from declarative to the procedural realm. And the only way, and again, I'm not reading all these definitions just for length, but the only way that information can go from declarative to procedural is by memorizing it. That you no longer have to like try to figure it out, like it's just memorized. That's what makes it easier. So the article talks about, he says he kind of compares it to a drummer, how if you play drums, your hands and your feet are all doing different things at the same times. And it's really, really hard in the beginning to kind of, get your body doing all that stuff. However, after a while, you no longer have to think about it. That is when you become an expert at drumming. That's when expertise is created, when you're no longer having to think about the individual parts. Or as the author says, fluency born of deep practice. Deep practice eventually leads to fluency. So then he says this. He says the paradox is that by memorizing so much, you can actually forget about the very thing that took up all your cognitive bandwidth. The automaticity is a liberation and affords the bandwidth for the kind of creativity that separates novice from experts. In other words, what he's trying to say is once you have stuff memorized, you no longer have to go through the cognitive load of trying to recall that information because you just know it. And because you just know it, it frees up your brain to think more deeply on these things. Now, here's the problem. When we constantly outsource basic operations to external systems, we prevent this crucial translation. So Google, ChatGPT, whatever. When we outsource this, we never give our mind's ability to become experts in certain things. So for example, an elementary student who learned 8 times 7 is 56, if they saw it written down as on the whiteboard as equaling 102, they would immediately know there's a problem. However, a student who hasn't learned that equation would see 8 times 7 equals 102, and they would have no idea. They would have no idea that there's a problem because they haven't actually learned it. And so he says this, he goes on to say this, without internally stored knowledge, the brain's natural error detection mechanisms lie dormant. We become not just dependent on external tools, but vulnerable to their failures, unable to distinguish sense from nonsense. Again, if you don't have your phone next to you, or if power goes out, or you don't have these digital tools around, and you're in a problematic situation, you're kind of stuck. Think of it this way. It's like with the rise of GPS, so many of us don't know actually how to go anywhere, especially in our own towns. And the moment you lose service or the moment your phone dies, because you don't know how to get around town, you're in trouble. So it's great for outsourcing until that thing is no longer available to us. Article goes on to then reference a study that went semi-viral around mid-June. So some of you might remember this, of a ChatGPT study where college students using AI could produce high-quality work but showed no actual knowledge improvement when tested later. So they did some stuff that made them look really smart, but their actual intelligence didn't go up. And in fact, some of the stuff they were talking about actually went down because they didn't actually have to learn the material. And then the author gives some ideas of what to do about this. I'm just going to share one that I like probably the most. He says it this way. He says, use AI as an amplifier, not a replacement. So use AI as an amplifier, not a replacement. He says this, when students have solid internal knowledge, AI becomes a powerful thinking partner. Without that foundation, it becomes a cognitive crutch that prevents real learning. So AI is a powerful partner after you've already got some foundational knowledge. I'm actually reading a book right now called The AI Thought Leader, which I probably will be reviewing at the next episode. And he actually talks about the same idea, about using AI as a strategic thinking partner. I think of it like this way. I'll give you a personal example of maybe how this works out. I've been preaching for 10 years. Maybe more than that, but at least consistently for about 10 years. So I know how to write sermons. I've developed a skill, done it for a while. I started using ChatGPT January, February of this year as essentially a thinking partner. I don't ask it to give me an outline or to write me a sermon. To be honest, it does not. It's the stuff it says ain't that good anyway. But it's really good as a research assistant. I mean, it's really good at saying, hey, like contextually, like why does this happen, or what would this what does this Greek word mean? Well, maybe that's not helpful because I do have some Greek word. I do have some Bible study tools that help me with the Greek, although sometimes the ChatGPT is faster. You could ask like, oh, this in Acts, in this story, it says this person is a proconsul. And this person, in this story, it says this person is a governor. Okay, in first century Rome, what's the difference between a proconsul and a governor? So when you actually like know how to write sermons and you need like a research assistant to like figure out like historically, give me some contextual things that we don't know going on there, or some questions that pop up that I have in my mind about how certain verses relate to this sort of thing. All that to say, like, because I've been preaching for so long, AI for me is a really helpful research assistant. If I had never preached before and I just started using ChatGPT to help me write sermons, that'd be very tempting to do. Hey, help me write a sermon. But then I would have like no real idea like how to actually write sermons for myself and to write good sermons. And I would be stuck using this machine that's going to write really poor sermons. Now, some of the insights might be really helpful, but they're not going to be that good. And so because I have like 10 plus years of writing my own sermons, using AI as a thinking research assistant, a thinking partner is really helpful. If I were to have started writing sermons with ChatGPT, my skill of writing sermons would be very difficult. And if I didn't have the internet, it would be really hard for me to write sermons. So that's kind of what I think was going on here. AI, think of it as a thinking partner, not a replacement. You've still got to do the hard work yourself. Last thing, our quote from his article, he then says this: the very architecture of expertise is built not by exposure, but by effort. Without internalized knowledge, there is no deep understanding, no flexible thinking, no meaningful creativity. The most advanced AI can simulate intelligence, but it cannot think for you. That task remains stubbornly and magnificently human. So, some quick thoughts. I know I kind of shared some as I was reading it. There is a difference. I would say this. There is a difference between needing to know something because it is good versus that's simply how it was in the past. So, the latter is kind of like when I was a kid, we just did it this way, as if like when you were a kid, it was the golden era. I remember when I was a kid, hearing people say that, and I always promised when I got older, I'm not going to be one of those people that says when I'm a kid, and I don't. 35, so I'm sure I've got a lot of age still to come, but I'm at the age now where I've got friends that people will say, well, when I was a kid, I'm like, I'm not going to do that because time's different. So let me give you an example of what I mean. Sometimes we need to remember things because it's good for us. Sometimes how we did in the past is irrelevant. Like, who really cares? Let me give you an example. Driving a car. Things are becoming more and more automated. And so certain things that are needed to be a good driver or to learn how to do are fading away. For example, checking blind spots. That's a big thing, especially when I was growing up, really probably for all of car existences until recently. But now, like with all of this stuff in cars, we got a 2018 Honda Odyssey a little bit ago. And so it's our first vehicle with some of the like technological stuff in there. And so anytime you turn on your blinker, if there's a car in your blind spot, the van beeps at you. And so the more that happens, the more automated cars get. At some point, like the whole thing about like being really careful about your blind spot, you don't really have to worry about it anymore because it gets automated away. It fades away. I'll give you another example. Looking over your shoulder when backing up. Again, when I got my driver's license, you had to turn your head when you were backing up to look over your shoulder because the rear of your mirror didn't give you enough space. Well, now I literally never look over my shoulder because I have a camera in my car. Now, if the camera were to go out, looking over my shoulder would be easy. So I just want to say, like, sometimes we complain that things are different when it's like, it's okay. I'll give you another example. How many of you can actually drive a stick shift? Now, depending on your age, the older you are, the more likely you're able to do so. But I probably more people than not these days don't know how to drive a stick shift. And what I say, is that a problem? If you don't think it's a problem, then you got to be careful saying when I was a kid, because again, for the longest time, all cars were stick shifts, were manuals. You had to learn how to drive it. Now, I will say, my first car was a stick shift. I can drive a stick shift. But regardless, again, nobody complains that, man, kids these days don't know how to drive stick shifts because like it doesn't really matter because it's not necessary. So all I want to say, is it a bad thing if people don't know how to drive a stick shift? Probably not, because cars are not made with 5-speed manual transmissions anymore unless like it's intentionally done. So some things, when they change, it doesn't matter. Some things like learning does matter. So you have to differentiate between like, it's okay that some things change and some things are different than the way that you were when you were a kid. But some things like learning, intelligence, memorization, those things still matter. And so we want to be able to continue to do some of those things. Now on to the book review. My book review of the book Because Internet by Gretchen McCulloch. I think that's how you pronounce it. Because Internet by Gretchen McCulloch. This book was really interesting. I'm gonna give you kind of overview some thoughts. It was a book about how language changes and develops over time, with an emphasis on how the internet has impacted our speech and writing. So it's kind of like language and how it's changed over time, but specifically, the last couple of decades, about how the internet again has impacted our speech and how we write. Overall, I want to say this: the book did deliver on its title, which is something I always personally appreciate when the book actually backs up the title. It did take a little bit, about 25% of the book through the book to kind of get there, to kind of get the point of the book. But then it did cover all the various ways the internet has impacted our language. It is written by a linguist, so it's someone who's an expert in this field. I will say there were spots that were really interesting and informative, and then there were times where it was long-winded and very uninteresting to me. So maybe that's a little bit of personal preference, but I was like, hey, that's really interesting. And then there were times I was like, this is irrelevant. I don't really care. I do think the book could have been about 20% shorter without losing anything, which would have made the book better overall. So some of those kind of dry spots where, I don't know, I felt like she was just like sharing stuff that she like had learned, was really interested as a linguist, but as like a normal person who's not a linguist, I'm like, it's kind of like this, like when you write a sermon, you got to take out this fluff sometimes that you as the pastor might be interested in, but it's like, it's not really relevant for the sermon. I felt like that sometimes with the book. I will say this: if you are interested in language, you would appreciate this book for sure. I picked it up because I simply like to learn, but unless you fall into one of the two above camps, you would probably have to work to finish the book. So if you're just someone who likes to learn stuff, or if you're interested in language, you'll probably like that book. If not, it'll take a little bit of work to get through. Overall, I'll give the book a 6.5 out of 10, which means there were some things I liked about it. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it to everybody, but there were some interesting parts. Now, let me point out a couple things that were really interesting to me. Number one, I found this fascinating, that language changes primarily from teenage girls. So, and this is not just because of the internet. I mean, she talks about like the history of all written language that we have and how we can figure this out, smart people stuff. But it's teenage girls like all throughout history. That is what is the primary driver for language change. Now, a big reason is because teenagers, as kids start to become older, teenagers just naturally want to differentiate themselves from adults and from their parents. And so it starts with teenage girls, and then the boys kind of catch on with it too. But it's because they want to be different, they start using different words and different language. And so they did all these studies of like 26, 28-year-old women today versus like 16 to 8-year-old women today, and vice versa, and how the shift happens. And so basically, it's a fun fact. It's not just a history thing, it's a human history thing. We can thank teenage girls for changing language and kind of making changes because people want to be different. And then when it becomes popular, everybody tries to learn the new lingo. I also want to say this, like it is okay that language changes. So again, kind of the grumpy when I was a kid, like there's nothing inherently right or wrong about language. It's just that we kind of are enamored of the language that we spoke when we were a teenager. And we kind of get stuck in that, and so we can be resistant to new language changes because, again, that's not how we spoke when I was a kid. I also want to say this. This is why, by the way, I am all for updated Bible translations. All for it. So sometimes people get grumpy because, well, the NIV was this in this year, and then it changed in 1984, and then it changed in 2011, and why can't it stay the same? Well, it's because language changes. It's why, by the way, I'm not a King James Version fan. I'm not saying there's anything wrong, and yes, there's some beautiful prose in it, but it's just, with every passing year, it is more and more confusing because people don't use that language, especially a non-Christian. They don't know what this means. So it's okay for updated Bible translations because language changes. At least that's my personal opinion. And anyway, that's what I took from the book. As always, man, thanks for being with me this episode. This episode was a little bit more in-depth, more intellectually stimulating with the Tower of Babel and the memory stuff. So hopefully you found it interesting and helpful. If you did, listen, I'd love for you to share this episode with your friend. And man, just keep listening. I'm really grateful for your time, and I'll be back with you next week for another episode of The Intentional Life.